everybody. Welcome to our first October webinar of 2024. Sneaky government document provisions, they can bite you in the booty. Now try saying that really fast 10 times. See if you can do it. I can't. Hello, my name is Alina Gilbert. I'll be presenting today. Oh, and I see my name is actually written on there. That's really cool. Wow. Okay, so let's do a few housekeeping things before we move on to the real nitty-gritty stuff. You should have all gotten a copy of the PowerPoint earlier this morning. If you didn't, feel free to email us after the webinar. My email address will be up there and we can resend it to you. All right. So again, thank you for joining us. I'm Alina Gilbert. I will be presenting. And the bulk of your screen should be the PowerPoint with the cat who lies a lot. And then to the left of that is a small screen with a presenter. Hi. All right. To the right of the screen, you will see a little chat icon. So that's what you're going to click on and type your questions into as we go through this. I will save all questions for the end, and time permitting, hopefully we can get through all of them. Sometimes we can't, but again, you'll have my email at the end of the slideshow, so you can always email me follow-up questions at that point, and I try really hard to get back to you in time. So if you are having any audio or any video issues, if only I could talk today, that would be amazing. If you are having any of those issues, there's a little icon at the bottom that says audio or video issues, question mark. Click on that. It'll take you through a few steps, and hopefully you will then come out of it and have everything working properly. Email, if you can't get through whatever your issues are and the little button's not helping you, you can try to email education@altitude.law, because we got somebody monitoring that on the other side, and they'll try and help you. But again, I would definitely go through the other steps first. Last but not least, there will be a survey at the end. And I always ask that if you have time and willingness that you fill it out for us. This is the only way we know what you are thinking, whether you like the presentation, whether you like the materials. It helps us put together, better classes and better presentations for you in the future. So please, whatever feedback you have, just please go ahead and provide it if you have time. Okay, without further ado, let us get started. So before we start looking at actual real provisions, I want to talk about a few rules of thumb when reading a declaration and when trying to interpret a declaration. So the biggest rule of thumb is don't assume, okay? Don't assume what? Don't assume, first of all, there's any logic or reason to where provisions are. Don't assume that the heading of a provision is accurate and that that's the only place you're going to find information about that heading. Take all of that out of the picture, because if there's anything I've learned over the years is that, depending on who drafted the covenants, when they were drafted, who the developer was, nothing is ever where it should be. And that's pretty much how it is. So don't try to use logic. Don't try to say, oh, I read the entire amendment provision, and now I know it takes 67% of the homeowners to amend, where like 2 articles down later in the declaration, there's another provision saying, but if you're changing these certain things, then you need first mortgagee approval. So don't ever assume that what you've read is the answer and that is the whole answer. And by the same token, then you should be reading everything, because we can never be sure whether the information we just got from this section or another section, whether that's everything. You just don't know. And ultimately, I know None of you want to sit here and read a full declaration every single time there's a question. That's another reason that HOAs have attorneys, is because sometimes you just need to call the attorney. And last but not least, don't ignore confusing provisions. We're going to have an example of that later on in the presentation, because ignoring confusing provisions oftentimes leads to a lot of issues, because chances are something got done wrong, or it's subject to challenge because no one's ever clarified the confusing provisions. So again, just a few rules of thumb. And now with these rules, let's start looking at some real provisions. And these provisions I have taken directly from various declarations that we have on file in our system for various associations. I did not modify them. I did not make them any more complicated than they already are. So these are real, 100%. So let's look at a few architectural review provisions that tend to come up and tend to cause a lot of problems if the board or manager aren't aware of them. So this particular one basically says architectural committee has to respond to requests within 60 days. If they don't respond within 60 days, essentially it's deemed approved, right? And the homeowner can just install whatever it is they just applied to install. It doesn't matter if it's not compliant with our documents. It doesn't matter if it's not compliant with, you know, the current code. We have given up our right at that point to say or do anything about it. So these are really important provisions, and we see them all the time. Sometimes it's 60 days, sometimes it's 45 days, sometimes it's 30 days. You really want to make sure that you are aware of these provisions, and you're marking it down in your calendars or your architectural committee calendars, because you don't want to miss the deadline. Once you miss it, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. So look for these provisions. Sometimes they're cleverly hidden. Sometimes they're in plain view under the architectural section in the declaration, but this is not an uncommon provision. So let's look at something similar now. So this is a provision that says that the committee has to respond within 30 days. And that's all it says. So if the committee does not respond within 30 days, what happens? Is the project approved? Should it be deemed denied? We don't know. This is an unclear provision, and arguably a homeowner could say, well, since you didn't respond to me within 30 days, I can now move forward with installing my new fence, my new patio, whatever it is, fill in the blank. And again, we don't know. So what do you do when you have this type of a provision, which is kind of open-ended, like you have to do X, but then we don't know what the consequences are if you don't? Well, there's a couple of options. One is when we have ambiguous provisions in covenants or in other governing documents, boards have authority to adopt resolutions, which are like policies, to clarify the ambiguity. And as long as it's clarified in a reasonable manner, okay, then it's going to be deemed, to be as enforceable as a governing document. So some associations I've seen adopt policies and regulations, rules, resolutions that say if the architectural committee does not respond within 30 days, it's going to be deemed rejected, not approved. And that's certainly one way to go. The ultimate solution, of course, is to amend your declaration that has this provision, to take it out or to clarify it or to change it in a way that works. But these are very problematic provisions. Ultimately, you want to make sure your architectural committee or board, whoever's doing this, does respond within 30 days, so this doesn't even come up. But if they don't, we're going to have a problem. One more architectural review. So this says that, you're going to have to, as a homeowner, when you're applying to, build something or add an improvement, you're going to need to make sure you get all your permits, licenses, certificates, blah, 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 anything that's required under local code and ordinances. So why is this a problem? Because I bet some of you are looking at this going, well, I have this in my community's declaration. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is this. When we have a requirement in our covenants, the association is essentially required to enforce what the declaration requires. We don't have to agree with it, we don't have to like it, but we have to enforce it. And if we don't enforce it, there is a liability exposure. So in this case, what we're seeing is an obligation through the declaration to comply with local code. Do all your board members know what the local code is? Do all your community managers know what local code is? Do you know what requires a permit? Do you know what the local ordinance says about height restrictions, setbacks? I don't. And essentially, this provision is putting the board, the association, in the place of an enforcement arm of the local ordinance, or the local municipalities. And this is dangerous. And for this reason, my personal opinion is we should not be referencing local laws or ordinances or anything like that in the declaration, because that is for local code enforcement to enforce, not the association. It shouldn't be the association. And I know some folks think, well, no, this is good because, if all else fails and we don't have anything else in our documents that allows us to address this issue, then we can use this language. Well, that is true. That is absolutely the truth. However, you don't get to pick and choose when you enforce this. You're essentially required to enforce it all the time. So you better be making sure then, as a board, as an ACC, that when you're getting these submissions, that the homeowners have complied with all of this. And that means a lot of extra work on your part. And if you miss something, you let them put something up and they needed a permit and they never had one, there's always a chance that the neighbor's going to sue the association and the individual board members or ACC committee members and say, you breached your duty. You did not require them to have a permit. You didn't ensure they had a permit and they were required to have one. So that's really the danger of this type of a provision. And these provisions are prevalent. They're prevalent in governing documents. So take a look at your documents. If you have something like this, again, know that it's in there. Talk to your attorney for your community about whether or not it's something that can be removed or what is recommended for the board to do to better be able to comply with this. Communication. Okay, this provision I have seen bite a lot of associations in the booty. So this is typically nowhere where you think it might be. It's usually towards the end of the declaration, and it says something like this, that, hey, owners have to provide the association with their mailing addresses, and that any notices that are not routine have to be sent by either registered or certified mail. So this particular provision gives us a little bit more information. It says that except for monthly assessment statements, okay, so we know that doesn't count, meeting notices and other notices deemed routine or ordinary by the board, right? So all other notices intended to be served upon an owner shall be sent either registered or certified mail. Look at the an owner language, because that is actually very significant. It implies that if we're sending communications to a single owner and not all of the other owners, that is now going to be considered something that's not routine. All right, what does that mean? Well, a lot of you have just updated your collection policies, and most of the associations don't want to send the initial, letter either by regular mail or some other form, like if you do a little notice of fines before you send the formal letter that talks about, oh, you're entitled to a payment plan, here's all the things that could happen to you, all that other stuff. That one has to go by certified mail under Kiowa. But the other letters are typically sent by regular mail. Well, if you've got this provision, no can do. You're going to have to send all those letters by certified mail or registered mail. If you have an enforcement policy, which you all do, you have to send notices under the enforcement policy. Well, if you have this language in your covenants, all of those notices are going to be sent by certified mail. They're not going by snail mail. And generally, any notice that gets sent out to an individual homeowner, if it's not going to all the homeowners, you are going to have to send that by certified mail. That is the most conservative interpretation of this provision. And why do we care about being conservative? Well, right now, as I think most of you know, the climate in the state, in the counties, in the courts is not very HOA friendly. Judges are scrutinizing everything associations do. They want to see associations dot their I's, cross their T's, and they're looking for reasons to not give associations what they want and to rule in favor of the homeowners. They're looking for it. They don't want to rule in favor of the associations. So at this point, being close is not good enough. We got to do exactly what the documents require, exactly what the law requires. Can't fudge it anymore. So keep that in mind if you do have this kind of a provision, that the safest option is to send anything that to an individual owner by certified mail. All right. Insurance, another great topic, and I love insurance. All right, no insurance policy. In this case, we'll have a deductible of $10,000 or 1% of the face amount of the policy, whichever is less. So let's do a little bit of math here. First of all, a $10,000 deductible might be able to get it for a property policy, but you're not going to get it for your wind and hail. And if you are a condominium community, a $10,000 deductible means your premium is going way up. And in this day and age, with the insurance market the way it is here in Colorado, associations can't even afford their, insurance policies given the premiums. They're all trying to increase their deductibles to hopefully help lower the premiums. So that aside, let's do some math. Everyone's favorite thing to do, math. Let's say if your entire community is valued at $1 million, which is laughable. But if your entire community is valued at $1 million, then 1% of that face value is going to be $10,000. Any community valued over $1 million, which is probably 98% of the communities, is going to have 1% of that amount is going to be much higher than $10,000. And so ultimately, those communities then are stuck with a $10,000 deductible because that's the lesser of those two options. Now, as I said before, there ain't no way you're getting a $10,000 deductible on a wind hail claim. Okay, unless you're a very, very small community, and like I said, you're valued at $1 million or less. You're not going to get it. And so what do you do when you have a provision like this, which is essentially impossible to comply with? Well, there is the sure fix answer, and then there is the lesser than sure fix, but still better than nothing answer. The sure fix is, you know what I'm going to say, amending the declaration to remove this cap on your deductibles. Well, as you also know, amending the declaration is not an easy task, is it? You gotta have homeowner approval. It's like a supermajority generally of homeowner approval. And you have to get buy-in from your homeowners to allow the association to have a higher deductible. And maybe that's something you can do. I mean, you tell homeowners, look, if we can't increase the deductible, our premiums go way, way, way up, and now your assessments are going way, way, way up. So maybe you can sell that to your homeowners. That's the sure fix. If we can amend and just remove this, perfect. But a lot of times we can't. We don't have the time to do it. We don't have the money to do it. We don't have the energy to go and try and convince a whole bunch of people to approve this. So we have a huge community. Whatever the reason, you know, amending the declaration is not always a feasible option for associations. So what's the next best thing? Well, the next best thing would be to adopt another resolution. And we've drafted lots of these for communities that have this type of language, where basically it says, we know we have this provision. We have done everything we could to try and comply with it, but it is not feasible. There's nothing out there in this market that allows us to comply with this. Therefore, we currently have a higher deductible than what's allowed, but we will continue diligently looking to try, you know, for lower deductibles to try and comply with this requirement. So what that does is it basically says, we know that this is a requirement, but we can't comply with it. We would love to comply with it, but we can't. And we're going to try to comply with it in the future, but for the time being, we just can't. That puts the association in a stronger position because then it explains the reason of why we're not complying, and we're explaining that we can't comply, as opposed to just having a higher deductible than what we're supposed to have and not having any explanation. Then we just look like we don't care about what the documents require. So if you do have a provision like this, I would encourage you to chat with your counsel for the association and see if they can prepare a policy like that for you, because I think that is the next best thing to an amendment. Okay, another insurance one. I swear to God, you cannot make this stuff up. So as you can see, I'm underlining the language that I want you to pay attention to. So this underlying language basically says, association, these are condominiums, by the way. Association, you have to ensure the interior of the individual units if they are financed by a first mortgage that is guaranteed by Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae, regardless of whether this is a common element or part of the unit. This is the very, very confusing language I mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk to you about. Yes, there's other confusing language, but this one, in fact, the association who has this language, I guarantee you they didn't realize they had this language, and if they did, they had no idea what it meant. And I'm not so sure that when they gave a copy of their declaration to their insurance broker, that the insurance broker truly understood what it meant. Because what it means is, essentially, if you have a unit that was traditionally financed, the association ultimately may be required to insure the interior of the unit. And that's no good, because now we have to figure out which units we're insuring and which ones were not traditionally financed or are all paid off. So VA loans won't count, FHA probably isn't going to count, but your regular traditional loans, sure, they're going to count. So now we're insuring some units and not other units, and I'm almost positive that in this case, at least, this is not what's happening to this community. And this is not the only time I've seen this language. We generally see it in older documents, not so much in the newer documents, but that doesn't mean they're not in there. So you should always check. But if you have language like this, I would recommend a couple things. One is you make sure that your insurance broker is aware of this language. And if there's any question as to what it means, you are going to get your HOA counsel involved. The other thing I recommend is you desperately try to get rid of that language from your declaration, which again, it means an amendment that gets proposed to your homeowners. But honestly, this one is worth it because this is so convoluted that it's all over the place. So let's look at like worst case scenario. You have a community that has this language. They don't know what it means. They ignore it because it's too confusing. We're going to ignore it. Because if you read the rest of this provision, it said like, and then the homeowners insure the interior of their units. So we're going to read it to say all homeowners must insure all interiors of their units, and the association is going to insure, the common elements. Okay, well, now we have a homeowner who moves into the community and they love to read documents that they hate the board. Guess what they're going to do? They're going to read through every single line, whether they understand or not. They're going to come across this provision and they're going to say, well, my unit was financed, through traditional financing. So I guess that means the association insures my unit. I'm going to reach out to the board or the management company and demand proof that my unit is insured under this section. That's going to be a problem. So again, the lesson to be learned here is if you have this kind of a provision in your insurance section or wherever else it may be, I would get in touch with both your broker and counsel for the association to figure out what you want to do with that and what can be done with that. Contracts. So this one refers to a management contract, but I've seen these provisions refer to just any contracts. So this particular example says that, when you're entering into a management agreement, it can't be more than 1 year of a term, and you've got to have a termination provision that allows termination with or without cause upon 30 days notice. Okay, great. So association enters into a management contract with ABC Management, and ABC Management has a 60-day termination clause. Association goes to its attorney, and attorney says, hey, you have a 30-day clause, and they say, well, that's okay, a management company is going to have to comply with a 30-day clause. That's the wrong answer. No contractor has to comply with any requirement you have in your declaration. That is a requirement on the association only. It does not bind outside third parties to comply with it. So you could very easily go to the contractor and say, I'm going to give you 30 days to terminate this contract because that's what my declaration says. And the contractor can say, go pound sand, we have a 60-day termination provision. And you have to comply with that. And in that case, the contractor would, in fact, be correct. You would have to comply with whatever you agreed to in the contract. So the rule to learn here is don't assume that anything in our documents binds outside contractors. And if you have provisions that govern how you enter into contract, what the contracts need to contain, that is fully on the board, on the association to ensure compliance with. So you're going to have to negotiate that management contract before it's ever signed to remove the 60-day, create a 30-day, and some contracts are not 1 year, some of them are 2 or 3 year terms. So if you're having your attorney review these contracts, great, because they'll catch that and they will make sure that things get adjusted. If you are not having attorneys review and you want to save some money, it's going to cost you more in the long run. And what's the risk of signing a contract that doesn't comply with this? Well, it's no big deal if nobody catches you and nobody makes a stink over it, then it's just let bygones be bygones. If you have that homeowner who hates the board and hates the HOA and wants to stick it to everybody, which there seems to be more and more of these homeowners, they're going to use this provision against the association. And they can sue the association for failure to comply with its governing documents, failure to, breach your fiduciary duty, whatever they're going to think of. And then they're going to say, I sued the association, I incurred attorney fees, pay me my attorney fees. And technically, if it went to trial, the association would lose, and the court would then be entitled to award the homeowner his or her legal fees. So that's really the risk in all of this. And be careful with these provisions, and please be in the know if you do have specific requirements in your declaration that requires certain provisions be in contracts. All right, restrictions. This kind of goes hand in hand with what we talked about before when we talked about architectural requirements and you have to make sure everyone has a permit and a license and whatever else. This is kind of the other side of it, that no use shall be made of property that would violate any statutes, rules, regulations. People used to think these are good provisions. They're catch-alls. I can use that because, if I have nothing else to rely on, I can say, hey, well, it's the violation of the law, so I could send a nastygram and I'd be done. Well, that's not, again, exactly true, right? It's if you are going to enforce this restriction, which you would have to if it's in your documents, then you have to know what it means to violate the statute of a government authority or governmental authority. So it means you have to know what the statute says. You have to know what the local ordinances say. You have to know what the local building codes say. Again, none of us, well, at least I'll just speak for myself. I do not know what each county's, cities, towns, ordinances specifically say and require. I would not be able to comply with this requirement and enforce this requirement unless I started reading through all these documents and trying to figure out what's what. And let's just be clear, nobody wants to read a book about local ordinances and what's allowed and what's not allowed. That's good. You think your declaration's confusing? Oh, you haven't seen anything yet. You don't want to go through that. So if you have a provision like this, A, obviously you need to know you have it, and B, you need to develop a strategy for what you're going to do about it. Now, most of the time, nothing comes of this. Associations have these provisions and they don't know what the ordinances say. They don't necessarily enforce the ordinances. Or they just simply say, well, we're just going to report it to the city and have the city come and check it out. And 98% of the time, it's all well and good. I don't want you to see this and freak out and think you're about to get sued. Most of the time, it's not a big deal. But I'm going back to that homeowner that hates everyone and hates the association and hates the board because they're looking for trouble. And this is another opportunity for them to cause trouble for your hopefully otherwise peaceful community. So be aware of these. You don't want to get caught off guard, and talk to the attorney who represents the association as far as what can be done. Obviously, the best case scenario is we amend it out. But not always possible. So talk with your attorney if you have this kind of a provision. All right. So the last couple of things we're going to talk about are actually provisions we typically find in the bylaws as opposed to the declaration. So this provision, this really applies not just to quorum. It could be applicable to just about any situation where you have a provision telling you how many homeowners have to approve something. And what I mean is, if you look at this, it's the presence of members who are entitled to cast 1/10 of the votes. So if we have 100 votes, 10% would be 10 votes. But this doesn't say 10% of the votes. It says entitled to cast. They have to be entitled to cast them, which means you got to look at your documents, and now you got to figure out when someone is delinquent or someone is in violation of the covenants, do their right to vote does it go away? Well, that would have to be in your documents. By statute, you can't take away their voting rights. It has to be, you have to have that authority somewhere in your documents, either in your bylaws, your declaration, your articles. So you're going to have to find the language and figure out whether or not this is something that the association can do, or this is something the association must do. Sometimes your documents will say if someone is delinquent, their power to vote shall automatically be revoked, or it shall be revoked. Other times it says if someone is delinquent, their voting authority may be revoked by the board. So you need to figure out, A, does that authority exist, and is it mandatory or is it permissive? If it's mandatory and that person loses their right to vote, well, now we got a different number of which we have to calculate quorum in this case. So let's say we've got 5 owners, or let's use round numbers. 10 owners who are delinquent or otherwise in violation of the covenants, and they are not entitled to vote. So now we're going to calculate the 10% off 90 homeowners instead of 100 homeowners, which means our quorum is now 9, not 10. And there's a sliding scale. You know, the higher numbers you have or the lower numbers you have, the more it impacts the end result. So sometimes you have provisions that say, to amend these bylaws, you must receive approval from owners representing 10% of the qualified votes, or votes entitled to be cast, like it says here. And when you see that language, a red flag should be going up right now in your head that says, oh, we need to figure out how many owners are entitled to vote right now. Now, sometimes you have a running tab of that, and it's great, no problem. But sometimes you don't. And so this is something that I would recommend, if you have this kind of verbiage, that you keep a running tab of the total owners who are authorized to vote versus those who are not. Because if you're going to have to start calculating quorums, approvals off the entitled to be cast category, you better know who that is and how many there are in that category, because that is going to be a different number than simple 10% of all votes. All right, another one. Election to the board of directors shall be by secret written ballot. Are some of you looking at this and saying, what's the problem? Isn't that what the law requires? Well, the law requires secret ballots for contested elections, which means more people running than positions open. It doesn't require it if you have 2 people running for 2 board positions. So this doesn't give us an exception. It says elections to the board shall be by secret ballot. In other words, it doesn't matter if it's a contested election or it's not a contested election. You have to use a secret ballot. And how stupid is that? I got 1 person running, 1 board vacancy, no one else wants to run, but we're going to pass around these secret ballots, or we're going to do a mail ballot vote, secret ballots, so that people can vote. Unfortunately, that's what you're going to be stuck with when you have a provision like this. So don't, take a look at your documents, make sure you don't just have that kind of a requirement with nothing else specified, because otherwise you are going to be stuck. And anytime you go, if you have an annual meeting in person, you're going to be bringing those blank ballots with you for any type of vote. Okay, so again, be aware if you have this provision, make sure you're ready for it, and ultimately, best case scenario, it gets amended out and you don't have to deal with it anymore. All right, we've gone through enough examples. I think By no means is this an exhaustive list. Every day I am surprised at provisions I read that I just can't believe that somebody put them in there. They're confusing, they don't make sense, they're illogical, whatever. So this is not an exhaustive list. There's always going to be more and more provisions. But these provisions that I talked about are provisions that are fairly common. And so they are good candidates for us to talk about today because you might have one of those provisions or more in your governing documents. So the last part of what I want to talk about is, well, what can we do with respect to these issues? I mean, if we have these provisions, what do we do? Well, so we talked about a couple options, right? We can adopt resolutions to clarify ambiguities. So the resolution can say, you know, our declaration says that, let me think of something good. Well, like even that one that with the insurance. Yeah, the insurance. It says that, you know, association has to insure units that are financed by Freddie Mac, whatever. This means the association will be insuring units that are traditionally financed. And we will not be insuring units that are, let me make it clear, what other kind of financing are we not insuring? So we have the right to do that. What we cannot do through a resolution is we cannot change anything that's in our governing documents. In other words, we can't put something in a resolution that contradicts something in the governing documents. I always like to use the example of, you know, owners may have a reasonable number of household pets. So a resolution could define what a reasonable number is. A resolution can define what a household pet is. If you have a resolution, for example, though, that says dogs are not household pets, that's not going to stand up in court. That's not a reasonable definition, right? Because dogs are considered household pets. And that's not something that you're going to be able to change if you don't want any dogs in your community by defining household pets in that way. By the same token, what's a reasonable number of pets? Well, if you adopt a resolution that says a reasonable number of pets is 0, that's not going to stand up in court because what you've essentially done is you've contradicted the declaration, which says you can have pets. And now you're saying, no, you can't have pets because 0 is the reasonable number. So what you've essentially done is flip that provision on its head to say no pets allowed. So again, as long as your resolutions are reasonable and they don't contradict what is already in your documents, then you are going to get deference from a court as far as homeowners being required to comply with whatever's in there. Amending the document. Obviously, that is the best case scenario when we have these kinds of provisions because we just don't want to have them in there at all. And best case scenario is we don't have these provisions, so we don't have to worry about interpreting them or complying with them. So amending the document is always an option. I recommend you think about or talk to your attorney about and see how feasible that is for your community. Because ultimately, it's better than keeping the provision and then being sued over it because you can't comply with it. The other thing I'd recommend is to the extent you find these types of provisions in your documents, you really should be making a note of them somewhere because as boards change, as community managers change, that institutional knowledge kind of goes away. And the only way to keep it is to pass on these notes, these documents that'll say, hey, keep in mind, here's some really important things that are required in our documents. And you have it. I think that is protection for the association, for future boards, for future managers. So I would definitely recommend that you keep a list, a running list of these things. And finally, and I'm sure I have not said that enough, make sure you consult with legal counsel. Ultimately, these provisions are, they are requirements. They are subject to interpretation. and they're legal documents that are subject to legal interpretation. So you really want to make sure you're consulting with the association's counsel as much as you need to ensure compliance with your declaration. So those are just some of the things, and probably the biggest things that you can do when you do encounter these provisions. But don't ever ignore them. Don't pretend they're not there. Don't hide your head in the sand. Somebody's going to find them, and somebody's going to call you on it, especially in this time of anti-HOA everything. All right, so a little bit of humor. Dun, dun, dun. All right, and I am now going to go through questions. There's a few, not too many, so I think we should be okay. What about the provisions that have after 30 days, a homeowner needs to resubmit via certified mail, and that doesn't happen and time lapses? Okay, so this is the architectural provision, and it says, you know, if the architectural committee does not respond within 30 days, the homeowner has to resubmit. So what it essentially is a denial. Okay, it's a denial. It's saying if we don't respond, sorry, you don't get it. And if you want to get it, you have to submit again. So it's essentially, homeowners are not big fans of these, right? Because they're like, well, why should I have to resubmit because you messed up the deadline? And on some level, they're not wrong. But on the other hand, when we have an automatic denial like that, it actually protects the neighbors of this individual, because what we're doing is we're ensuring that if the homeowner submitted something crazy and outrageous, we don't want them to have carte blanche to now go put it up, because that could impact property values of our neighbors. And just because the committee didn't act in time, we don't want to penalize all the people who live around this person by having him put up whatever he wants or she wants. All right. Do resolutions need to be filed with the clerk and recorder? No, they don't. Resolutions are really the same thing for the most part as rules. Rules, policies, resolutions, they're kind of in the same category of they are adopted by the board. They are approved by the board. Homeowners don't get to approve them. And the caveat being that none of these documents can contradict what you have in your other governing documents, like in your declaration, your bylaws, your articles of incorporation. And they obviously are enforceable as any other governing document if they follow the requirements. Okay, next one. Speaking of insurance, do you know where we can get insurance on a central propane tank? Wow, that's probably something we can talk about offline, and I would say shoot me an email, and I'll see if I can get you any information on that. You know what? I just did something in here, and all my questions just disappeared. Please, if you guys could retype a question if you didn't get an answer, because we have 12 minutes and I'd like to answer questions, and I don't know what happened because, wait, hold on, wait. No, never mind, I found it. I'm sorry. Just goes to show you, me and computers, not friends. Never, not friends at all. We have different quorums for different votes. Can this be simplified? Yeah, I mean, what you would do is amend the document that contains the different quorums to basically just have one quorum for everything, and that would be recommended. It depends on which document it's in. So if it's in the declaration versus the bylaws, because there's different approval requirements for the documents. So you'd probably want to consult with legal counsel, have them tell you what specifically needs to happen and what process you need to utilize for that. We have owners stating that city code states that a maximum of 4 cats and 4 dogs are allowed in a residence. They are stating that this code allows for them to have 4 cats and 4 dogs in the community. What is the best way to respond to this? Well, so what you have to do is think of it as homeowners, when they live in a home, they're subject to all sorts of restrictions, right? They're subject to municipal ordinances, but they're also subject to the covenants, and they've agreed to abide by those covenants. Our covenants can be far more restrictive than what the local county says. So the county or the city might say 4 dogs and 4 cats, and our declaration might say no more than 2 household pets per residence, and they have to comply with that. So one, what the county says does not impact what the HOA says, and vice versa. So ultimately what happens is whatever's more restrictive is going to be the rule that they have to comply with to not be in violation. Otherwise, they're going to be in violation either of the HOA documents or the city documents or both. And they need to comply with both. And that's a good question. Are there consequences if a notice or letter to homeowner is not sent by certified mail? So if your documents require certified mail and you don't send it by certified mail, then whatever it is you're sending, the whole process is pretty much going to be nullified in court. So if you're sending a letter for a delinquency notice and you don't send it by certified when your documents require it, most likely that's going to be used as an objection if we end up in court, and a judge is going to be like, nope, you didn't follow what your declaration requires, I'm throwing this out. So that's really probably one of the biggest consequences. Same thing with enforcement. So if you want to be able to enforce your stuff and to collect your delinquent assessments, you need to comply with these documents or with these provisions. What about delegation of responsibility from a board to a manager with regards to approving without committee review? So, that's typically between the board and the management company, and how that's structured. It's really, I've seen boards give that kind of authority to their manager. But I will tell you one thing, ultimately, you as a board or you as a committee, you're not protecting yourself from liability by shifting this to a management company. You are still ultimately responsible for all of these decisions, regardless of whether you make them or someone else makes them, and you have the ultimate liability exposure. So keep that in mind when you decide and whether to delegate duties or not. What control or interest might an HOA board have over redecorating a unit that might involve moving walls or augmenting plumbing? That's a great question, but unfortunately, that is going to be subject to your documents. It's going to be document specific, and the documents typically speak about whether homeowners have the right to augment units, to move walls, and how that all works. So I can't answer that without having to look at your documents. So I would recommend, if this is something that's coming up in your community, consult with the community's attorney to figure out what owners can and can't do. If a ballot has one named person and a blank to fill in another person's name, not nominated from the floor, is that not a contested election? If you are sending out mail ballots for an election, we will always tell you that you need to put in blanks because it's like nominations from the floor. And we do consider that and treat it like a contested election. Yes. And I suspect you're talking about the provision that said that all elections have to be by secret ballot. So what I'm talking about is if you're at a meeting and you got 2 positions open, 2 people say they want to run, and nobody else wants to run from the floor, it's not a contested election, but you're still going to have to do a secret ballot vote. So that's kind of what I'm talking about in that case. Is it okay to just deny an application because the board and the committee are not responding to approved or denied. I think that's a very dangerous stance to take, because if you do not have anything in your governing documents that speaks to this, the homeowner has a pretty good argument if we end up in court that the board essentially, or the committee, acquiesced to this because they didn't respond. They didn't say no, so I took it as a yes. And there are courts who will agree with that analysis. So I suppose you could try to adopt a resolution saying if you don't have a response within X number of days, it's deemed a no. But you most likely, well, you most certainly are going to need to have your documents reviewed to make sure taking that kind of a stance doesn't conflict with anything else you have in the documents. And it's going to be document specific at that point. Do we have to keep executive board meeting minutes for the next board? So board meeting minutes should be kept forever and ever and ever. It's the formal record of corporate actions, and you should never be getting rid of them. And hopefully you have them on the website for the community, but if not, they should be getting stored somewhere, because we don't ever recommend getting rid of minutes. Is there a definition of a secret ballot? And if so, is the HOA required to follow it? Well, the typical definition of a secret ballot is that it has no identifying marks to be able, for anyone to be able to figure out who voted how. And that is used broadly. So it means no names, no addresses. We run into problems when we have weighted voting because somehow those ballots have to be marked so we know how much weight to give each one. And then technically it's not a secret ballot because you could then narrow down the units, which it could be. So a true secret ballot is one that you can't trace back, you can't identify who it came from, you can't even narrow it down. What might be the best place to store the bylaws, rules, and regs and resolutions? If you have a management company stores that for you, and typically it's also on the website. If you don't have a management company, then you will probably need to figure out how that's going to be stored as far as in a computer somewhere, and how then that gets transferred to future boards. Are there requirements concerning notifying homeowners when the resolution is adopted by the board? There actually is. Kiowa has a requirement that says you have to send by regular mail a postcard, or you could do it bigger, but a postcard letting homeowners know that the resolution's been adopted and where they can find it. So if it's on the website, you just give them a link to that. Okay, what happens when ARC appeals go to the board and the documents are silent? Can this occur if the board is the ARC due to volunteers? Oh, due to no volunteers. Well, there's really no entitlement to an appeal from a decision, an architectural decision. There's nothing like that in the statutes. So it's something that would have to be specified in the governing documents. If there's an appeal process, and then it would tell you what the appeal process is. If the board is acting as the DRC, then clearly the appeal process would be to the same body that we had. If it's not, then the appeal would be to the board typically. But if there's nothing, if the documents are silent as to architectural appeals, then it is, unfortunately, there's not going to be an appeal at that point. How can quorum per the declaration be enforced? Our governing documents refer to several classes of voters. That is not followed. So I suspect, and you're going to need an attorney to look at your letter, I suspect the classes of owners is going to be the developer and then all owners, and probably the developer is long gone and you probably don't have classes anymore. You probably only have one class at this point. And I checked with your legal counsel to see if that's the case, because you probably don't have classes. Okay, everyone, I know, and I am respecting your time, and I know I have like 3 or 4 more questions that I did not get to. So please feel free to email those to me under my email address here. And I really, really appreciate you listening in. And if you have time to do the feedback form, that'd be great. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.